He mocked his silent wife. Then the Mafia Don called her Princess. Some women are silent because they have nothing to say, and some women are silent because they are waiting for the exact moment when one word will bring an entire empire to its knees. Damien Ashcroft spent 3 years married to a woman he believed was nothing, quiet, empty, forgettable. He laughed at her in a courthouse full of witnesses. He signed those divorce papers like he was releasing dead weight. But when the armored convoy arrived and the most feared man in the city stepped out and whispered one single word, Princess, Damien finally understood. He hadn't been married to a ghost. He had been sleeping beside a loaded gun, bombed. If the story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning of the divorce, Celine Voss woke before the alarm. She lay still for a long moment in the guest bedroom she'd moved into 8 months ago, staring at the ceiling in the gray pre-dawn light. The sheets were crisp and cold. The room smelled faintly of nothing. No cologne, no cigarette smoke, no leftover warmth from another body. She'd chosen this room precisely because it smelled like nothing, because nothing was what she needed to think clearly. She sat up slowly. Her feet found the floor. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't check messages. She sat at the edge of the mattress with her hands folded in her lap and breathed in through her nose for 4 counts, out through her mouth for 4 counts, the way she'd trained herself to do in the years before Damien, in the years when breathing was the only thing standing between her and a panic that could swallow her whole. Today was the last day of a 3-year performance. She needed to be calm for it. In the bathroom mirror, she studied her own face the way a painter studies a canvas before the final brushstroke. 31 years old, dark eyes that gave nothing away, a mouth that had learned stillness the way other women learn to smile. She'd been told, by Damien mostly, but by his friends too, the ones who thought cruelty was the same thing as candor, that her face was difficult to read, that she made people uncomfortable, that there was something unsettling about a woman who never seemed rattled. She had taken that as a compliment every single time, even when it wasn't meant as one. She dressed carefully, black trousers pressed to a clean line, a charcoal blouse with a collar that sat high at her throat. No jewelry except the small pearl earrings her mother had given her the last Christmas before she died. Celine put them in slowly, one at a time, watching her own hands in the mirror. Then she picked up the leather folder from the desk, the one she'd checked 3 times the night before, and walked out of the guest bedroom without looking back. Damien was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs. He was standing at the espresso machine in a suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a small ceramic cup. Vanessa Hale was perched on the counter beside him in a dress Celine recognized as the one Damien had bought on their anniversary trip to Milan 2 years ago, the dress he'd claimed he lost the receipt for. Vanessa was laughing at something, that bright manufactured laugh she deployed like a tool, sharp and precisely timed. She stopped when she saw Celine, but only for a beat. Then she smiled, slowly, the way cats smile when they've already eaten the thing you were looking for. Damien turned. He looked Celine up and down once, the way he'd been looking at her for the better part of 2 years, like something he'd overpaid for and couldn't return. "You look like you're going to a funeral," he said. Selena set her leather folder on the kitchen island and checked the clasp. "I'm going to a courthouse," she said. "Same difference." He finished his espresso in one long sip, set the cup down with a small, decisive click. "You know, most women in your position would be falling apart right now." "I know," she said. The word most was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and she let it sit there without touching it. Vanessa slid off the counter and smoothed the front of her dress. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful. Carefully maintained, deliberately presented. She looked at Celine with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between the two. "I'll meet you at the car," she told Damien, and walked out without acknowledging Celine at all. Damien watched her go. He had the look of a man admiring something he'd recently acquired. Then he turned back to Celine, and the look shifted. the warmth draining out of it like water from a tub. "The lawyers will handle everything," he said. "You don't need to speak unless they ask you a direct question. I've already made sure the settlement terms are clear." He paused. "It's more than fair." "I'm sure it is," Celine said. Something flickered across his face. It might have been irritation. It might have been something closer to discomfort. The discomfort of a man who has rehearsed an argument and finds that his opponent isn't going to show up to have it. "You're not even going to fight me on this, are you?" he said. Not a question. "No," she said. He stared at her for a moment, and in that moment she could see him cycling through his mental inventory of her, searching for the lever that would produce a reaction. The tears, the raised voice, the cracked composure he'd been expecting since he'd filed the papers 6 weeks ago. He'd had his own attorney and 3 mutual friends prepare him for Celine's grief. He had a whole architecture of self-justification built around the certainty that she would be devastated. She was not devastated. She picked up her leather folder and walked past him toward the front door. "Celine," she stopped but didn't turn. "When this is over," Damien said, "and you're sitting in whatever apartment you can afford on the settlement," he let the pause do its work. "Try to remember you had the best years of your life in this house." She stood with her back to him for exactly 2 seconds. "I'll try," she said, and walked out. The courthouse was a granite building downtown with wide marble steps that always seemed to catch the wind. By 10 in the morning, the steps were busy. Lawyers with wheeled briefcases, clerks on smoke breaks, a cluster of journalists waiting on something unrelated to anything happening on the 3rd floor. Celine arrived 7 minutes early and stood at the base of the steps with her folder under her arm, watching the traffic move in the street below. The settlement was designed to make her disappear quietly. Damien's attorneys had spent 6 weeks constructing it, enough money to constitute a reasonable payout, structured in a way that would make any challenge expensive and slow. A non-disclosure agreement running 47 pages. Restrictions on what she could say, to whom, about what. The kind of document that was less a legal agreement and more a muzzle dressed up in contract language. She was going to sign every page of it. That had been the plan for the past 14 months, longer, if you counted the period she'd spent deciding whether the plan was even necessary. But it was necessary. It had always been necessary, because the alternative was letting Damien Ashcroft believe he had been exposed, and a man who believed he was being exposed was a man who destroyed things. She needed him calm. She needed him confident. She needed him to believe with his entire chest that he had won. The marble steps were cold through the soles of her shoes. Damien arrived 11 minutes later with Vanessa and 2 attorneys who walked on either side of him like walls. He was smiling, that broad, easy smile he wore in rooms full of people he believed were watching him, which was most rooms. He spoke briefly to one of the attorneys, gestured toward the entrance, then saw Celine at the base of the steps and aimed the smile at her like a flashlight. "Ready?" he called across the distance between them, too loud, the way people are loud when they want witnesses. She nodded once. Inside, the 3rd floor conference room had the particular atmosphere of a place where things end. Fluorescent light, industrial carpet the color of old regret, a long table with a pitcher of water nobody would touch. Damien's 2 attorneys sat on one side. Celine's single attorney, a quiet woman named Frances Park, who charged less than she was worth and never wasted a syllable, sat on the other. Frances had advised Celine early in the process that she could contest the settlement on several grounds, that the NDA had provisions that were arguably unenforceable, that the asset division was structured to obscure the full scope of Damien's holdings. Celine had listened to all of it carefully and then said, "Sign it as written." Frances had looked at her for a long moment across the desk. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Celine had said. Now in the conference room, the documents were laid out in sequence. Celine read each page before she signed it, not because she was looking for escape clauses, but because she wanted Damien to watch her read and believe she was looking for escape clauses. She wanted him to feel the slow satisfaction of watching someone search for the exit and find none. He sat across the table with his hands folded and his smile dialed down to something professional. Vanessa had been asked to wait in the lobby, which Damien had allowed with the slightly pained expression of a man making a gracious concession. Celine turned pages, signed where indicated, initialed the boxes. She was on page 31 when Damien leaned forward slightly and said, quietly enough that only she would hear, "You know, I used to think you had something going on behind those eyes, some kind of inner life I was missing." He let a small pause develop. Took me a while to figure out there was nothing there. She looked up from the document. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make him wonder, not long enough to give him anything, and then she looked back down at the page and kept signing. She heard him exhale, a sound of satisfaction, the sound of a man confirming what he already believed. She initialed the final box on page 47, closed the folder, and slid it across the table. Francis gathered the documents. The attorneys exchanged copies. There was the brief procedural exchange that accompanies the death of a marriage, formal, efficient, stripped of everything human. And then it was done. Damien stood first. He buttoned his jacket with the practiced ease of a man who has won many things in rooms like this. His lead attorney said something in a low voice, and he nodded, already turning toward the door, already moving on. Celine. He said her name the way people say the names of places they've been to once and won't be going back to. "I hope you land on your feet." "I will," she said. He gave her one last look, the kind of look that contains, if you know how to read it, a whole private history of contempt. And then he walked out, his attorneys flanking him, the door swinging shut behind them. Frances waited until the door had closed before she said very quietly, "For what it's worth, I've been in this business 23 years, and I still don't know what you're doing." Celine picked up her leather folder. "I know," she said. "That's the point." The marble steps outside were busier than they'd been an hour ago. Noon traffic on the street below had thickened into a slow procession of cars and delivery trucks and bicycle couriers. Celine came out through the glass doors into the cool midday air and stood at the top of the steps for a moment, her folder under her arm, her face entirely still. Damien was already on the steps below her, speaking to Vanessa, who had emerged from the lobby with the particular radiance of a woman who has been waiting for good news and just received it. He had one hand at the small of her back. He was saying something that made her laugh again, that same deployed laugh, and he was smiling down at her with the warmth he'd stopped aiming at Celine somewhere around the 14-month mark of their marriage. Then one of his attorneys said something sharp and low, and Damien turned. The street below the courthouse steps had gone very quiet. Not silent, the city was never silent, but the particular white noise hum of moving traffic and distant voices in ordinary urban life had altered in a way that was hard to name but immediately felt. Like pressure changing before weather, like the moment in a room full of people when something shifts and everyone knows it before anyone can say what it is. 3 black SUVs had pulled to the curb, then 2 more behind them. Then another 2, until there were 7 in total, their engines idling with the deep, contained sound of restrained power. The vehicles were identical, armored, their windows opaque, their plates clean and unremarkable in the way that only intentional absence of identity can produce. Doors opened, not all at once, but in sequence, precisely, like something choreographed. Men in dark suits emerged, 12, 14, more, and arranged themselves along the base of the steps in a formation that was not aggressive, but was absolutely, unmistakably deliberate. They stood with the particular stillness of people who have trained the impulse to fidget out of themselves entirely. Damien stopped speaking. Vanessa's laugh died. The journalists who'd been clustered near the steps moved instinctively, not away but sideways, the professional instinct to reposition for a better angle. The rear door of the 3rd SUV opened. Lucien Moretti stepped out into the midday light. He was 61 years old, and he looked it, and also somehow didn't. His hair had gone entirely silver in a way that read not as age but as authority. He was not a large man, not in the way that Damien was large, broad, and deliberately physical, but he took up a different kind of space, the kind that has nothing to do with physical dimension and everything to do with the certainty that the world will move to accommodate you. He wore a gray suit, simple and without ornament, and he moved up the base of the marble steps with a measured, unhurried stride. He did not look at Damien. He did not look at the journalists. He did not look at any of the attorneys or the courthouse staff who had gathered near the doors above. He looked at Celine. He climbed the steps until he was one step below her. A deliberate posture, she knew, not submission, but recognition. And he stopped. The men behind him stopped. Everything stopped. Lucienne Moretti looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were dark and still, and carrying something that, in a different man, in a different life, might have been called grief. Then he bowed his head, not deeply, not performatively. A single, quiet, irrevocable inclination of the head that communicated more than a speech. And he said one word. Princess. The word landed on the steps like something dropped from a great height. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. In the particular silence that had settled over the courthouse steps, it was the only sound in the world. Celine looked at him. 3 years. 3 years she had not seen his face except in photographs. 3 years she had been Celine Voss, corporate wife, silent and unremarkable, the woman in the background of other people's photographs. And now she was standing on the steps of a courthouse with her signed divorce papers in a leather folder under her arm, and the man who had raised her from the age of 14 was looking at her like she'd come back from somewhere very far away. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm. Just that. No words yet. She was aware, without looking, that Damien was standing 6 steps below and slightly to the left, and that he had not moved, and that every cell in his body was performing a rapid and catastrophic recalculation. "The car is ready," Lucienne said quietly. "I know," she said. She walked down the steps past Damien without looking at him. She didn't need to look at him. She could feel the specific quality of his stillness, the stillness of a man whose entire model of reality has just been structurally compromised and who hasn't yet had time to build a new one. At the bottom of the steps, one of Lucien's men opened the rear door of the third SUV. Celine got in. The door closed. The convoy pulled smoothly away from the curb, and the sound of the city filled back in behind it like water closing over a stone. In the weeks following the divorce, people would try to reconstruct the sequence of events, and they would fail because the sequence had been designed to resist reconstruction. It began, or seemed to begin, with a series of regulatory inquiries. Quiet ones, the kind that don't make the news immediately, flagged by compliance software and escalated through channels so standard and unremarkable that by the time Damien's financial team identified the pattern, 3 separate audits were already in motion. Offshore accounts associated with Ashcroft Capital's subsidiary networks began experiencing processing delays. Not freezes, nothing so dramatic, just friction. The kind of friction that, in a legitimate business, would be annoying. In a business structured the way Damien's was structured, friction was catastrophic. He made calls. His calls were not returned. He made different calls. The people who answered said things like, "We need to monitor the situation, and we're keeping all our options on the table," which are the phrases people use when they have already made a decision and don't want to be the one to tell you what it is. His senior financial officer came into his office on a Tuesday morning and closed the door, which was never a good sign. "Someone's moving against us," he said. Damien had not slept well in 5 days. He looked up from a spreadsheet that had stopped making sense 2 hours ago. "Who?" he said. "That's the problem." His CFO sat down across from him without being invited. "I can't find a signature. Whoever's doing this knows exactly how we're structured. Every pressure point, every dependency. It's like they—" He stopped, started again. "It's like they built the map from the inside." Damien stared at the spreadsheet. From the inside. He thought about 3 years of board dinners where Celine had sat quietly and spoken rarely. About late nights when she'd told him she was reading, and he'd believed her because why would he lie to himself about something so insignificant? About the filing system in his home office that he'd never once thought to question because she was the one who'd organized it, and organized things stayed organized, and you didn't ask who built the mechanism as long as the mechanism worked. He thought about the courthouse steps. The word Princess Landing in the noon air like a stone dropped into still water. His CFO was still talking. Damien heard perhaps 30% of it, because the other 70% of his attention was occupied by a single, very cold, very late-arriving realization. He had spent 3 years married to a woman he'd never once tried to know, a woman he'd dismissed as decoration, as background, as noise at a frequency too low to bother hearing. And she had spent those same 3 years in his house, at his table, beside him in rooms full of people who would later wish they'd paid closer attention. And she had been building something. He just didn't know yet what she'd built. But the feeling sitting in his chest as his CFO talked about regulatory exposure and liquidity risk and the vanishing loyalty of longtime partners, that feeling was the specific, bone-deep cold of a man who has just realized he was never in control of the thing he believed was most his. Outside his office window, the city continued its ordinary business, indifferent to the particular quality of his dread. He picked up his phone. He pulled up Celine's contact. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he put the phone down without calling, because some part of him, the part that had always been better at calculation than he'd given it credit for, already knew that calling her was exactly what she was waiting for. And Damien Ashcroft had not survived this long by giving people what they were waiting for. He just wasn't sure, for the first time in a very long time, whether that instinct was going to save him, or whether it was already too late. The name Matteo De Luca said over Eleanor's landline was not Luciano's. That was the first thing that hit her. The shape of her expectation colliding with the reality, the way you brace for impact and then get hit from a completely different direction. She had assumed Luciano. She had been so certain it was Luciano who had given her blueprint to the rival family that the name Matteo actually said took several seconds to land properly. "Say that again," Serena said. "You heard me. I heard you. Say it again." A pause on the line. Then, with the patience of someone who understood that certain information needed time to be absorbed. Marco Setti. Marco Setti. Luciano's consigliere for 14 years. The man who had sat across from Serena at more family dinners than she could count, who had sent flowers when her mother died, who had once told her with what she had believed was genuine feeling that she was the steadiest person in any room she entered. Marco Setti, who was 60 years old and had 2 daughters and a house in Westchester 3 miles from the property Luciano had just given her in the divorce settlement. "When?" she said. 3 years ago. He came to me. He wanted—" Matteo paused again, and she had the sense he was choosing his words with the care of someone who had learned that precision mattered more than speed. "He wanted insurance. He believed Luciano was moving in a direction that would ultimately destroy the organization. He wanted to establish a relationship with my family before that happened. And he gave you my framework as a credential. He gave me your framework as proof that Luciano's strategic success was not Luciano's." Serena turned away from the window. She put her back against the wall of Eleanor's hallway and looked at the ceiling and breathed slowly through her nose. "He's been feeding you information for 3 years," she said, "selectively, and not always accurately. Marco Setti is a man with divided loyalties, which means his information is always filtered through whatever he believes will best serve his own survival. So you don't trust him. I don't trust anyone who comes to me with a gift that valuable without a transparent motive, but I verified the framework independently. It took my analysts 8 months to fully understand it." Another pause, and this time she could hear something shift in his tone, something that was neither warm nor cold, but had a different quality. Something almost collegial. "It is genuinely extraordinary work, Serena. I want you to know that I understood, the moment my people confirmed its authorship, what it meant that your name was nowhere on it." She said nothing for a moment. "Where do you want to meet?" she said. "Tonight, if you're willing. I'll send an address." "Send it to this number." "I'll send it in an hour." She hung up, stood in the hallway with Eleanor's phone in her hand. The street outside the window was still doing its ordinary street things. The dog walker, the delivery truck now gone, a kid on a bicycle. Everything moving at its own pace, indifferent to the fact that 12 hours ago she had been the wife of the most powerful criminal organization head on the East Coast, and was now standing in borrowed clothes in a borrowed hallway, holding borrowed information that was beginning to feel like something far heavier than she had expected. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Well," she said, "Marco Setti." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then, "The consigliere." "He's been working both sides for 3 years. He gave De Luca my 2014 framework as an opening credential." Eleanor sat down on the bench beside the coat rack and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor. She was doing the thing she always did when information required organizing, not speaking, not reacting, just processing with the systematic deliberateness of someone who had spent 4 decades turning complicated facts into usable arguments. If Seti has been feeding DeLuca information for 3 years, Eleanor said, and if your divorce was timed to something Luciano is currently executing, then Seti knows what Luciano is executing, Serena said, and DeLuca knows what Luciano is executing, and I'm the only person in this equation who doesn't. Not anymore. Not anymore. Eleanor looked up. You're going to meet him. Tonight. Be careful about what you trade for what you receive. I know. I mean it, Serena. You're outside the structure now. You don't have the protection the structure provided. If DeLuca decides you're more useful as a piece of leverage than as an ally, then I become leverage, Serena said. But I don't think that's what this is. Why not? She thought about the card, the handwriting, the 3 lines that had said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing else. The phone number, the way Matteo DeLuca had said, I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you, not I've been waiting for the right moment to use you, which is what Luciano would have said, which is what any of the men she had spent 22 years studying would have said. Because he already had the framework for 3 years, she said. If he wanted to use me as leverage, he would have moved before now. Eleanor didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded. I'll keep working on the Adriatic Meridian thread, she said, and I want you to call me when you get back tonight, whatever time it is. I will. I mean it. Eleanor, Serena looked at her directly. I know. The address Matteo sent was a restaurant in Tribeca. Not a private room in a hotel, not a warehouse, not any of the theatrical locations she had half expected. A restaurant. A real one. With other diners, an ambient noise, and a host who knew the reservation and led her to a corner table near the back where the sightlines were good, and the ambient noise provided enough cover for conversation. Matteo DeLuca was already there. He was younger than she expected. 52? Maybe 53? Dark. Not as physically imposing as Luciano, but with a different quality of presence, the kind that came from stillness rather than size. He was sitting with his hands on the table when she arrived, not his phone, not a drink, just sitting, watching the door. He stood when she approached, not a performance of courtesy, a habit. She could tell the difference. Serena, he said. Mr. DeLuca. Matteo. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please. She sat. A server materialized and she ordered water, and then, after a moment, wine. Red. She didn't look at the list, she just named a producer and a region, and the server nodded and disappeared. Matteo watched her do this with an expression that was difficult to read, but that she filed away anyway. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? I'm not certain. Something harder, perhaps, or more frightened. He paused. You signed those papers yesterday and walked out of the building alone, and by midnight you had already begun pulling threads. You had someone watching. I had someone in the building, not watching you specifically, watching the Moretti executive floor. You were unexpected. He picked up his water glass. When my contact told me you had left alone and that the security team had been told to stand down, I understood what Luciano had done. And you sent the card. I sent the card. You said you'd been waiting for the right moment. She looked at him steadily. Why is now the right moment? He set his glass down. Because Luciano's port operation closes in 6 weeks. Once it closes, the capital structure locks, and the laundering mechanism becomes operational. At that point, extracting it from the financial architecture becomes, he paused, choosing the word, substantially more complicated. For whom? For the families that don't want cartel money embedded in East Coast port infrastructure. For the federal investigators who've been circling the Moretti financial network for 3 years and haven't been able to penetrate the ownership structure. He paused again. And for the person whose strategic framework is currently being used as the operational backbone of a money laundering operation without her knowledge or consent. Serena kept her face neutral. You're asking me to help you stop it. I'm asking you to come work for me, he said. Chief Strategic Advisor. The DeLuca family's legitimate business empire is substantial. Shipping, logistics, real estate, infrastructure. I need someone who understands the architecture of these systems at the level you do. He paused. And yes, I would like your help understanding the specific vulnerabilities in Luciano's current operation because you built the framework it runs on, and I believe you can identify the precise points at which it will fail and should fail. The restaurant noise continued around them. 2 tables over, a couple was celebrating something. The woman was laughing at something the man had said, head tilted back, genuinely delighted. Serena watched Matteo De Luca across the table and thought about 22 years and 12 pages of handwritten notes and a name she had not expected to hear on a phone in Eleanor Graves's hallway. Marco Setti, she said. What does he want? Matteo's expression shifted slightly. He wants to survive whatever happens to Luciano. He believes Luciano's operation will collapse, either from internal pressure or external intervention, and he wants to be positioned somewhere safe when it does. So he's been building a lifeboat. With my family as the lifeboat. Yes. And you accepted that arrangement. I accepted information in exchange for a conditional guarantee of protection that I am not legally or morally bound to honor if the information proves inaccurate or if his actions create problems for my organization. He said it without inflection, as if he were describing a standard contractual clause. I'm not sentimental about Marco Setti. I took what he offered because it was useful, and I'll continue to take what he offers for the same reason. But you don't trust him. I told you. I don't trust anyone who arrives with a gift that significant. She looked at him for a long moment. Including me? He met her eyes. You didn't arrive with a gift. You arrived because I sent a card to a woman who had just been stripped of everything, and she called the number on it because she's intelligent enough to know that options matter more than pride. He paused. I trust your intelligence. I trust your analysis. I trust that your interests and mine are currently aligned, which is more than I can say for most people I work with. And when our interests diverge? Then we'll have that conversation when it arrives. She picked up her wine glass and turned it slowly and looked at the color of it in the light. The framework, she said. Tell me specifically what you know about how Luciano is using it. And Matteo De Luca told her. It took an hour and 40 minutes and 2 glasses of wine for her and a single espresso for him. And by the end of it, Serena understood things about the last 4 years of the Moretti operation that she had only partially understood when she was inside it. The framework she had built in 2014, an integrated logistics and capital flow model originally designed to optimize the Moretti family's legitimate shipping network, had been adapted without her knowledge into the structural skeleton of a much larger and substantially more criminal operation. The port acquisition, Matteo explained, was a consolidation play across 3 eastern seaboard ports, Newark, Baltimore, Savannah. Legitimate on the acquisition level. Investment-grade infrastructure, pension fund co-investors, a PR narrative about American logistics modernization that had already been covered sympathetically in 2 major financial publications. Beneath that structure, threaded through the holding companies and the subsidiary networks, was a capital routing mechanism that used the port's cash flow variability to absorb and process money from Barranca Capital's cartel-connected investors. The mechanism was elegant, it was efficient, and it was built, structurally, on the exact principles Serena had articulated in her 2014 framework, the principles of using legitimate variable cash flow businesses as absorption nodes for capital that needed provenance laundering. She had never intended that application. She had built the framework to optimize shipping efficiency. But the underlying architecture was adaptable, and Luciano, or more precisely, the people Luciano had hired to execute this, had adapted it. He didn't understand it fully, she said, almost to herself. He never understood the mechanics. He understood the outputs. Correct, Matteo said. Which is why the implementation has 3 structural vulnerabilities that any competent analyst would have caught during the build phase. She looked up. Show me. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, A single page, dense with numbers and organizational chart fragments, clearly a copy of something larger. He placed it on the table between them, and she leaned forward. She looked at it for 2 minutes without speaking. Here, she said, pointing at a capital routing node between the Newark holding structure and the Barranca feeder vehicle. This flow assumes stable quarterly variance, but port cash flow isn't stable quarterly. It cycles on a 7 to 9 week lag relative to shipping contract settlements. If you stress test this node during a lag cycle, the absorption capacity drops by 60%, and the surplus capital has nowhere to go within the structure, which means it surfaces. In a form that's visible to anyone running a standard anti-money laundering screen on the feeder vehicle's banking relationships. She straightened. This would have been caught in the build phase, by me, if I had been involved. But you weren't. But I wasn't. She folded the paper and slid it back to him. He built an operation on my framework without my involvement and introduced errors that the framework was specifically designed to prevent. She was quiet for a moment. That's almost elegant in how stupid it is. Something that might have been amusement moved briefly across Matteo De Luca's face. He needed the framework to establish credibility with the Barranca investors. They'd heard about the Moretti family's logistics precision, your precision, and they wanted that applied to their capital routing. Luciano told them he could deliver it. Without me. Without you. She was quiet for a long moment. When did he know the operation had vulnerabilities? 8 months ago, Matteo said. His internal analysts finally ran the stress test you just described and identified the same node failure. They've been trying to patch it since then. He paused. They haven't been able to, because fixing it requires understanding the architectural principles behind the original framework, and none of them have access to those principles. Because I have access to those principles. Because you are the principles. The restaurant noise continued around them. Somewhere across the room, a phone rang and was quickly silenced. The celebrating couple at the nearby table called for their check. Serena picked up her wine glass and finished what was left in it and set it down and looked at the tablecloth for a moment and then looked back up at Matteo De Luca. The divorce wasn't about the other woman, she said. No. He needed me gone before the operation closed, because if the operation failed, which it will if that node isn't repaired, and I was still connected to the family, I would have been inside the blast radius. That's my assessment. And he couldn't bring me in to fix it, because bringing me in would have required explaining to me what he'd built on my work, which would have created a different problem entirely. So he removed you, Matteo said. Quickly, completely, with military efficiency. He paused. He underestimated how much you'd been paying attention. Everyone underestimates that, she said, quietly, without bitterness. Just as a statement of fact. Matteo looked at her for a moment. Will you come work for me? Yes, she said, but I want 3 things. Tell me. First, I want access to every document your organization has received from Marco Setti, every communication, every piece of intelligence, every financial detail. I want to understand the full picture of what he's been selling you and verify its accuracy against what I know. Done. Second, I want to work as an advisor, not as an employee. I set my own hours, I operate independently. I report to you directly and only to you. No intermediaries, no handlers, no security detail assigned to monitor my movements. A pause. That's a security risk. It's my condition. Another pause. Done. Third. She looked at him steadily. When this is over, when Luciano's operation collapses and the federal investigation runs its course, I want formal documented acknowledgement that the 2014 strategic framework originated with me. Not from Luciano. Not from the Moretti organization. From me. Matteo was quiet for a long moment. That's not something I can produce directly. I wasn't the one who used it without attribution. I know, but you have 3 years of communications with Marco Setti that establish the framework's true origin. I want those preserved and available. He studied her. You're thinking past the immediate situation. I'm always thinking past the immediate situation. He nodded slowly. Done. They shook hands across the dinner table in a Tribeca restaurant while the kitchen noise drifted from the back and the celebrating couple pulled on their coats nearby, and Serena felt the particular weight of a decision that cannot be walked back settling into her chest like ballast. She had just aligned herself with the Moretti family's greatest rival. There was no version of what she had just agreed to that Luciano would interpret as anything other than a declaration of war. She started the following Monday. The DeLuca family's legitimate business operation ran out of a converted warehouse building in Long Island City that had been renovated with the kind of restrained, expensive taste that communicated seriousness without ostentation. Open floor plan, natural light, conference rooms with glass walls. An atmosphere that was, she noted immediately, almost entirely unlike the Moretti Global Holdings Tower. No marble, no engineered intimidation, no architecture that was designed to make visitors feel small. Matteo introduced her to his senior advisors in a single meeting, 6 people around a conference table. She shook 6 hands and said 6 names back to the people they belonged to as she shook them, and watched 6 faces calibrate their initial assessment of her. She recognized the calibration. She had been calibrated by rooms full of men for 22 years. She knew what it looked like, and she knew, with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent 2 decades in this specific environment, how to respond to it. She didn't respond to it. She sat down and opened the folder of materials Matteo's team had prepared and started asking questions. Precise questions. Specific questions. Questions that required numerical answers and organizational detail, not narrative. Within 20 minutes, she could feel the calibration shifting in the room. Not to acceptance, not yet, but to something more useful, which was attention. By the end of the first week, she had produced a 30-page strategic assessment of the DeLuca family's legitimate logistics network, identifying 7 operational inefficiencies and 4 market opportunities that had been overlooked. She delivered it to Matteo on Friday afternoon, and he read it in front of her, actually read it, not skimmed, and then set it down and looked at her across his desk. "How long did this take you?" he said. 4 days? He looked at the document again. Luciano had this kind of analysis available to him for 22 years. Yes. And he presented it as organizational intuition. He presented it as his. Matteo was quiet for a moment. When he looked up, his expression was not quite anger, but something adjacent to it. The specific kind of cold clarity that comes from understanding something about a person that retroactively explains a great deal. Send this to the logistics team with implementation priority markers. I want responses from each department head by next Wednesday. I already flagged the priority sequence in the appendix. He looked at the document again, found the appendix, read the priority sequence. Of course you did. Rot. The anonymous messages began on the 3rd week. The first arrived as a voice message on the secure line Matteo had set up for her, a line that only 7 people knew existed. The voice was digitally altered, unrecognizable as male or female, and the message was 42 seconds long. It described, in specific detail, a meeting that had taken place 3 days earlier between Luciano's consigliere, Marco Setti, and a federal agent the message identified only by the name The Accountant. She played it 3 times. Then she went to Matteo. "Someone inside Luciano's organization," she said, "is telling us that Marco Setti met with a federal contact 3 days ago." Matteo's expression didn't change significantly, but something behind it did. Setti has been careful about his federal relationships. He's always maintained that any cooperation was hypothetical, contingent. This message is saying it's no longer hypothetical. Who sent it? I don't know. The line is supposed to be known to 7 people. 8, Matteo said quietly. I added one when you started. A contact inside the Moretti organization I've maintained for 2 years. She looked at him. You didn't tell me. I'm telling you now. The air in the room shifted slightly. It was not quite a confrontation. Neither of them moved, neither of them raised a voice, but it had the particular quality of a moment in which something beneath the surface of a working relationship had just become visible. If you're going to ask me to navigate this situation effectively, she said, I need complete information, not curated information, not information you've decided I'm ready for. Understood. Say it plainly. He met her eyes. You'll have complete information going forward. I apologize for the gap. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, making sure the message had landed, and then nodded and looked back at the phone she was holding. The second message, she said. There was a second one. She played it. This one was shorter, 21 seconds, and described something that made her go very still when she heard it. It described a conversation that had taken place the previous evening in the Moretti family's private dining room. A conversation between Luciano and two men, the message identified as senior representatives of the Barranca Capital Group. A conversation in which Luciano had told the Barranca representatives that the structural vulnerability in the capital routing mechanism had been identified and that the architect of the original framework had been neutralized and removed from the equation. He had told the cartel's investors that he had handled the problem. He had told them the operation was secure. And in 6 weeks, when the port acquisition closed and the capital routing mechanism went live, they were going to discover that it wasn't. He lied to them, Matteo said. He told them what he needed to tell them to keep the deal alive, she said. He needs the deal to close because the Moretti family needs the capital commitment from Barranca. If he goes to them and says there's a structural problem he can't fix, they pull out. The whole acquisition collapses. And everything Luciano has built on that foundation collapses with it. So he's buying time. 6 weeks of time. And then her phone buzzed. Not Matteo's secure line, her personal phone, which she had bought new and registered under Eleanor's name. Only Eleanor had this number. She looked at the screen. A text message, 4 words.
He knows where you are. She showed the screen to Matteo. He read it. His jaw tightened slightly. The first physical sign of stress she had seen from him. He stood up from behind his desk and moved to the window and looked out at the street below for a moment, with his hands in his pockets and his back to her. How? She said. SETI. He didn't turn around. If SETI is moving toward federal cooperation, he's also trying to demonstrate value. One way to demonstrate value to Luciano, to maintain his position while he decides which direction to fall, is to tell Luciano things Luciano wants to know. Like where I am. Like where you are. She looked at the text again. Eleanor was frightened enough to break protocol in text rather than call. That told her something about how immediate Eleanor believed the threat to be. She called Eleanor. It rang once and Eleanor picked up. What happened? Serena said. A man came to the building 40 minutes ago. Eleanor's voice was controlled but tight around the edges. He didn't come to my door. He stood on the sidewalk across the street and took photographs. I recognized him. He worked security for the Moretti family. I saw him twice at events I attended with you. Did he see you notice him? No, I watched from the upstairs window. Pack what you need for a week and go to your daughter's house. Don't tell anyone else where you're going. Go now. Serena, Eleanor, now, please. A pause. All right. She hung up. She looked at Matteo, who had turned back from the window and was watching her with the steady attention of someone who has just received confirmation of a threat they had been aware of but hoping to avoid. The Westchester property, she said. The one from the divorce settlement. Luciano gave it to me. Yes. He gave it to me knowing I couldn't access my accounts, knowing I'd have nowhere else to go after the penthouse was locked. She stopped. He expected me to go to Westchester. He expected me to be contained there, isolated, financially dependent on the settlement timeline, visible to whatever surveillance he placed on the property. But you didn't go to Westchester. I went to Eleanor. She was thinking through it as she spoke, the way she always thought through structural problems, following the logic of the architecture, identifying the points at which the design revealed its intention. He didn't expect Eleanor. She wasn't in his calculation. But SETI knew about Eleanor. SETI knows about everyone. He was consigliere for 14 years. She felt something cold and specific move through her chest. Not fear, exactly, but the feeling of a board being cleared, the feeling of pieces being removed from a game that was still being played. SETI told Luciano about Eleanor. Luciano sent someone to photograph the building. She paused. He's not trying to hurt me. You sound certain. If he wanted to hurt me, I'd already be hurt,
He's trying to locate me. He wants to know if I've found anything. He wants to assess the threat I represent. She looked at Matteo steadily, which means he's not certain how much I know. Then let's keep it that way. We can't. She said it flatly, without drama, because it was simply the truth. He sent someone to photograph Eleanor Graves's building. Eleanor is 78 years old, and she has nothing to do with any of this except that she was kind enough to open her door. She stopped. This moved past containable this morning. Matteo studied her for a long moment. What do you want to do? She thought about the 12 pages of notes, the Adriatic Meridian thread, the structural vulnerability in the capital routing node, Marcosetti meeting with federal contacts while simultaneously feeding location intelligence to Luciano, the Barranca representatives being told the problem was handled, the port acquisition closing in 6 weeks. She thought about the fact that she had spent 22 years watching and building and keeping her own counsel, and that the sum total of that patience was now in play in a situation that was moving faster than any of it had been designed to move. She thought about Luciano's face across the conference table, the calculation she had seen underneath the single moment of eye contact. He had planned to make her disappear. He had not planned on her disappearing in the wrong direction. I need to see everything Seti has given you, she said. Every document, every communication, every piece of intelligence, tonight. She paused. And I need you to set up a meeting with whoever your federal contact is, the investigators who've been circling the Moretti financial network. Matteo was quiet for a moment. That's a significant step. I know what it is. Once you make contact with federal investigators, you can't undo it. Whatever happens afterward, I know what it means. She looked at him directly. Luciano spent 22 years building an empire on work that was mine. He used my framework to construct a money laundering operation for cartel investors, and then he removed me from the structure to protect himself when it started failing. She paused. And now he's sending men to photograph the home of a 78-year-old woman who gave me somewhere to sleep. She picked up her bag. Tell me when you can get the federal contact on the phone, she said, and I'll tell you exactly how to bring the whole structure down. She was already moving toward the door when Matteo's desk phone rang. He picked it up, listened for 4 seconds, and said her name. She turned. His face had changed. Not dramatically. Matteo De Luca did not do dramatic, but enough. The steady quality of his attention had shifted into something tighter, something that had an edge to it she hadn't seen before. Seti, he said. He just made contact with my office. He wants an emergency meeting. A pause. He says Luciano found out about you being here. The room was very quiet. He says Luciano isn't trying to locate you anymore, Matteo said. He said it carefully. The way you say something when the thing you're saying has changed the nature of the problem entirely. He's calling a sit-down, Matteo said, with every major family on the eastern seaboard, tomorrow night. He paused. And he's put your name on the agenda. Reyes looked like a man who had been used to deliver a message. That was Damien's first thought when he walked into the hospital room and saw him. Not the injuries themselves, which were extensive and carefully applied, but the arrangement of them. Nothing life-threatening, nothing permanent. Every bruise and cut positioned to be visible, to be read, to communicate exactly what the sender intended to communicate. I can reach anyone. I reached him. You're next or you're not, depending on what you do in the next 24 hours. Reyes was propped against the elevated back of the hospital bed with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been frightened out of a dimension of himself he didn't know he had. His left eye was swollen mostly shut. His right hand was wrapped from the wrist to the middle knuckle. He tracked Damien's entrance with his one open eye and said nothing while Marcus stayed outside the door. Damien pulled the chair from the corner of the room and sat. He didn't say anything either for a moment. He looked at Reyes the way you look at a document you need to read quickly and accurately. Who did this? Damien said. Men I didn't recognize, Reyes said. His voice was careful around the swelling on the left side of his jaw. They weren't from any operation I know. What did they want? They didn't want anything. Reyes shifted against the pillow. His face contracted briefly with pain, then smoothed itself back out by force of will. They weren't asking me questions. They were delivering something. What? Reyes looked at him with his one open eye. There was something in it that Damien hadn't seen there before in 7 years of working with the man. Something that wasn't loyalty or fear or the careful neutrality of someone keeping calculations private, but something rawer than any of those. Something that looked, if Damien read it correctly, like pity. "A message," Reyes said. "For you." "Say it." Reyes breathed through his nose. Once, twice. "Vittorio Sans knows you're going to the meeting tomorrow night," he said. "He's known since before he called you. The call wasn't an invitation. It was a confirmation." He stopped. "The warehouse is already staffed, has been for 2 days. He's not meeting you to negotiate. He's meeting you to close something out." Damien sat with that for 3 seconds. "How do you know this?" he said. "Because the men who did this—" Reyes gestured at his face with his wrapped hand, a short, economical gesture. "Told me to tell you, specifically. They said Vittorio wanted you to know that the meeting was a trap before you walked into it." He paused. "They said he wanted you scared." "Why would he want me scared if his plan was to—" "Because a scared man makes mistakes," Reyes said. "And a scared man who tries to run confirms everything Vittorio needs confirmed about where your loyalties are before he moves against the Moretti family." He met Damien's eyes. "You're not the target, Mr. Ashcroft. You've never been the target. You're the trigger." The room was very quiet. From somewhere down the hall, a monitor was beeping in steady rhythm, patient and indifferent. "The trigger for what?" Damien said, though some part of him, the part that had been doing cold math for 48 hours on a dining room table covered in handwritten notes, already knew. "A war," Reyes said simply, "between the Moretti family and every other major organization in the territory. Vittorio's been building it for years, funding rivals quietly, feeding false intelligence, moving pieces." He stopped. "You were one of the pieces, Mr. Ashcroft. Your operation, your connections, your marriage, all of it was placement. You were inside Moretti's proximity through her, through Celine. And when you divorced her publicly and Moretti showed up on those courthouse steps, Vittorio got the photograph he needed of Moretti personally involved with a known criminal enterprise. That photograph is currently in the hands of 3 rival families and 2 federal liaisons." Damien stared at him. "The affair," he said slowly. "Vanessa. The divorce. Engineered," Reyes said. "Not by Celine, not by you. The introduction was arranged. The timing was managed. You were given every reason to stray, and every reason to believe straying was your own idea." He paused. "I'm sorry. I knew parts of it. Not all. Not enough to—" He stopped. "I should have told you sooner." Damien stood up. He moved to the window. Outside, the city was doing its nighttime business. Lights moving, traffic thinning, the ordinary metabolism of a place that didn't know or care what was being dismantled inside it. He thought about Vanessa's face in the restaurant on Mercer. "Be careful." The memory card sitting in his breast pocket with photographs of Celine's handwriting on a routing schema. He thought about Celine's face on the courthouse steps. The absolute stillness of it, the quality of a woman who had been waiting for something and had just watched it arrive on schedule. He turned back to Reyes. "Does Celine know?" he said. "About Vittorio, about what he built." Reyes looked at him for a long moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that Celine has known about Vittorio Sans for considerably longer than either of us has." He didn't go back to the apartment. He drove instead, with Marcus silent in the passenger seat, through the city's nighttime geography. Not toward anything, just through it, the movement itself serving the function that stillness couldn't. His mind was doing something he recognized from the early years, before the money and the power and the accumulated certainty that he was the smartest person in most rooms he entered. It was running very fast and very cold, stripping variables, discarding assumptions, looking for the load-bearing walls in a structure that had just shown itself to be built on a different foundation than he'd believed. Vittorio Sans had been running an operation for years, how many years was still unclear, that used Damien as a proximity device, a way to stay close to the Moretti orbit without being visibly close. If you wanted to watch a family, you planted someone near them. If you wanted to eventually destroy a family, you planted someone inside their trust, then manufactured a public incident that tied Moretti's name to criminal exposure, then handed the evidence to his enemies. Celine had been the plant, Damien had been the host, and the divorce, The public, courthouse steps divorce with Lucien Moretti arriving in a 7-car convoy and bowing his head and saying that word had been the photograph. Except Celine had also spent 3 years documenting Damien's financial architecture, had copied every ledger, every routing schema, every shell account, had handed an encrypted drive to Lucien Moretti on the day of the divorce, which meant either she was working for Vittorio and the documentation was part of the trap, something to be used against Moretti to implicate him in Damien's crimes, or she had been working against Vittorio from inside Vittorio's own plan, using the access she'd been given to build a case against everyone. He needed to know which one. He pulled out his phone. He looked at Celine's contact for the 3rd time in 2 days. Then he put the phone away and said to Marcus, "Take me to the Moretti estate." Marcus glanced at him. "That's not a neutral move," Marcus said. "No," Damien agreed. "It's not." The gate guard at the Moretti estate was a man named Petra, who had the build of someone who'd spent decades doing physical work and the face of someone who hadn't enjoyed most of it. He looked at Damien's car for a long moment through the intercom camera before his voice came through the speaker. "Mr. Ashcroft." "I need to speak with Celine," Damien said. A pause. "Wait," Petra said. They waited 11 minutes. Damien counted them. At the end of 11 minutes, the gate opened. They were escorted, 2 of Lucien's men flanking the car the entire length of the drive, to the front of the main house, where another man met them and walked Damien inside while Marcus was asked, with professional courtesy that didn't invite argument, to remain with the vehicle. Damien was taken not to the study, but to a smaller room off the main hall. A sitting room, functional and undecorated, the kind of room used for conversations that weren't expected to last long. He was left there alone for 4 minutes. Celine came in without knocking. She was in different clothes than she'd been in that morning, dark trousers again, a loose gray shirt, her hair pulled back. She looked like someone who had been working, which she probably had. She looked at him, the way she'd looked at him across the conference room table when he'd told her there was nothing behind her eyes. Steadily, without giving anything away, waiting to see what he was going to do before she decided what she was going to do. She didn't sit. He didn't either. "Vittorio Sans," he said. Her expression didn't change. Not a flicker. "You know," she said, "I know parts of it." He moved to the center of the room. "I need to know if you're working with him or against him. Because right now, from where I'm standing, the evidence goes both ways." "What evidence?" she said. "The routing schema. In your handwriting, found in the house 8 months ago." Something moved in her face then. Very small, very controlled, but there, a recalibration. "Vanessa found it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She breathed through her nose. Her jaw moved once, slightly, the way jaws move when someone is deciding whether to be angry about something or to file the anger away for later use. "That document was placed," she said. "By who?" "By me," she said, "for her to find." The room was very quiet. Damien looked at her. He was aware of the fact that he was standing in a house that wasn't his, talking to a woman he'd spent 3 years dismissing, and that the geometry of this conversation was almost perfectly inverted from every conversation they'd had during their marriage. She was the one with information. She was the one with access. She was the one who knew the shape of the room they were in. "Why?" he said. "Because I needed to know if Vanessa Hale was Vittorio's asset inside your operation," Celine said. "If she found it and told you, she was clean. Her loyalty was to you, not him. If she found it and disappeared it, she was reporting to someone else." She paused. "She told you. 8 months later, and under pressure, but she told you. Which means she was yours. Which means Vittorio's access to your operation wasn't through her." "Then where?" Damien said, though he was already feeling the answer coming, could feel it approaching in the specific way that bad information approaches, displacing the air in front of it. Celine looked at him for a long moment. "Your CFO," she said. "Daniel Marsh. He's been on Vittorio's payroll for 4 years." The silence that followed that sentence had a particular texture. Dense. Resistant to words. Damien thought about Daniel Marsh. 14 years of employment. The man who had come into his office and closed the door and said someone's moving against us with exactly the right amount of concern. The man who had given him the framework for understanding his own crisis, and who had therefore also been the man shaping what Damien looked at and what he didn't look at. The questions Marsh had answered, the questions he'd redirected. The map of his own organization that Marsh had been drawing for him for 14 years. "I need to sit down," Damien said, and he wasn't sure if he said it out loud or only thought it, but either way he sat, on the edge of the chair nearest him, with his hands on his knees and the full weight of the past 72 hours settling onto him with the finality of something permanent. Celine watched him. She didn't move toward him. She didn't offer anything. She stood with her arms at her sides and watched him absorb what he'd been given the way a doctor watches a patient absorb a diagnosis, clinically, necessarily, without sentimentality. "How long have you known?" he said. "About Marsh, specifically. 14 months. I found a payment trail in the subsidiary records that originated outside your network structure. It took me another 3 months to follow it back to Vittorio's financial intermediaries." She paused. "I've known about Vittorio's overall architecture for most of our marriage." "From Lucienne?" he said. "From my own work," she said, and the precision in her voice, not defensive, just exact, landed in a way that his dismissal of her, 3 years of it, couldn't survive. "Lucien knew Vittorio was active. He didn't know the scope. I spent 3 years inside your operation mapping it because Vittorio's money was threaded through your subsidiary structure, and the only way to document it was from the inside." Damien looked up at her. "You went into our marriage to gather evidence against Vittorio Sans," he said. "I went into your operation," she said quietly. "The marriage was the mechanism, but Damien—" She stopped. Something shifted in her face. Not softness, but a kind of precision that was more honest than softness. "What you built was real. Vittorio used it, but you built it. The crimes in those records are yours. I didn't manufacture them. I documented them." He held her gaze. There was no cruelty in the way she said it, no satisfaction. It was the worst kind of statement, the kind delivered without animus, which meant it couldn't be resisted as an attack. It was simply true. Simply, precisely, irreversibly true. He looked at his hands on his knees. "What happens now?" he said. She opened her mouth to answer. The window behind her exploded inward. The sound was enormous and immediate. Not the cinematic gradual awareness of danger, but the physical violence of it arriving all at once, glass and pressure, and a concussive impact that knocked the air from the room. Damien was out of the chair before he'd made the decision to move, some ancient autonomic function overriding everything, and he hit the floor behind the chair as something tore through the wall where his head had been. Celine was already moving. She was flat against the interior wall below the window line, with a control that told him this wasn't her first time in a room where something came through a window. Her face was tight and very pale, and her eyes were moving, to the door, to the ceiling, to the ruined window, in a rapid professional scan that had nothing to do with panic. Shouts from outside, running feet on the gravel drive. Damien crawled to her position. His hands were shaking. He could feel them shaking and couldn't stop it. And he was aware simultaneously of the shaking and of the bizarre clarity that had settled over his thinking, the way fear at sufficient intensity becomes a kind of cold precision. "Shoot her," he said. "At least one," she said. "Elevated. Across the east wall. Your people. Already responding." She looked at him with those eyes that gave nothing away, and then they gave something away. A very brief, very specific calculation. "Can you move?" "Yes." "Then stay behind me and do exactly what I say." He almost said something. The reflex was there. 3 years of speaking to her as though she required management, as though her judgment was a provisional thing that needed his endorsement. He felt the reflex and he let it die. "Okay," he said. She moved for the door. The next 4 minutes were the most disorganized and concentrated minutes of Damien's life. They moved through the hallway in a low crouch, Celine ahead, pausing at each corner with the specific patience of someone who has been trained to prefer a moment's delay over a permanent mistake. Twice she stopped him with a hand flat against his chest, and they waited, pressed against interior walls while running feet passed on the other side. Lucian's men were moving in organized patterns outside. Damien could hear it through the walls, the coordinated quality of the response. Nothing frantic. But there were other sounds too, less organized, and those were the ones that kept the cold running through the center of his chest. They reached a room at the back of the house, a utility room, low-ceilinged, smelling of cleaning supplies, and Celine closed the door and set her back against it and finally breathed, fully, the breath of someone who had been rationing their breathing for 4 minutes. Damien stood in the middle of the room and looked at his shaking hands. "Vittorio's people," he said. "Yes," she said. "They came early, before the meeting." "They were never going to wait for the meeting," she said. "The meeting was for you. This—" She gestured at the ceiling, at the sounds coming through the walls. "This was always the plan, tonight, while I'm here, while Lucian's attention is on securing you." He looked at her. "They're not here for me," he said. "No," she said. "They're here for you." She held his gaze and didn't answer, and that was an answer. He thought about what Reyes had told him. You're the trigger, the public divorce, the courthouse steps. The photograph of Lucian Moretti bowing his head to a woman who was, by now, documented in the hands of his enemies as an intelligence asset operating inside a criminal enterprise. The picture that made Lucian look exposed, vulnerable. The picture that gave every rival family the opening they'd been denied for 40 years. If Celine died tonight inside Lucian's estate, it was war. Immediate and total, and fought on terms that Vittorio had spent years selecting. "He needs you dead," Damien said. "Not because of the evidence you have, because of what your death starts." "Yes," she said. "And the evidence you have, the drive you gave Lucian, is copied," she said, "in 3 locations. But Vittorio knows that. He doesn't need to stop the evidence. He needs the war to start before the evidence can be deployed. Because once the families are fighting each other, nobody's examining his financial records." She paused. "He needs this to happen tonight." Damien stood in the middle of the utility room with the smell of cleaning supplies and the sound of organized violence outside, and looked at Celine Voss, at the woman he had dismissed for 3 years, had mocked in a courthouse, had believed was empty, and felt the specific, irreversible sensation of a man arriving, very late, at a true understanding. "Where's the evidence deployed from?" he said. She looked at him carefully. "Why?" she said. "Because if we can get it out before the shooting stops," he said, "before Vittorio can frame tonight as a Moretti aggression, if every family gets the full financial record simultaneously, his coalition fractures," she said. "Can you do it from here?" She was quiet for 2 seconds. 3. Her eyes were moving again, running the calculation. And he was aware, watching her do it, that she was running a calculation that had many more variables than his, that she was seeing a board he still only partially understood. "There's a secure terminal in the East Annex," she said. "Lucian's communications center. If it's still intact and we can reach it—" A sound from outside. Very close. Not running feet. Something lower. Something that came through the wall as vibration rather than noise. Celine's head came up sharply. She moved to the door and pressed her ear against it and went perfectly, absolutely still. Then she turned back to him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not fear. She didn't appear to have a ready relationship with fear. Something more precise than fear. The expression of a woman who has just identified the exact worst-case variable. "There's someone in the house," she said. Not Lucien's people. He understood that from her face without needing her to say it. "How many?" he said. "I don't know." She looked at the door, at him, at the door again. "The East Annex is through the main corridor. If they're between us and the terminal, then we go through them," Damien said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He was aware that he was a man who had, 20 minutes ago, walked into this house as someone seeking information and was now standing in a utility room deciding to move toward danger rather than away from it. And that this decision was not complicated, and that the lack of complication was itself something new, something that had arrived without announcement in the past 4 minutes of cold fear and was now simply present, like a change in weather. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said.
Damien. Her voice was very even. If we go out that door and they're in the corridor, then we're in trouble, he said. We're already in trouble. The difference is whether we're in trouble standing still or moving. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned to the door, and she opened it, and they went. The main corridor was dark. The lights had been cut, which meant this was coordinated and not incidental. And the darkness had a quality of occupancy, of breath being held somewhere inside it. Damien moved behind Celine with his hand against the wall and his pulse enormous in his ears. And she moved with a precision that he tracked by sound alone. And the distance between their position and the East Annex was 40 feet of darkness that felt infinite. They were 12 feet from the annex door when the figure stepped out of the alcove to their left, large, moving fast, something in his hand catching the faint light from the annex window. Celine reacted before Damien had processed the threat. A sharp lateral movement, the sound of impact, a struggle that lasted 4 seconds and then stopped. The figure went down. She was breathing hard beside him, the first time he'd heard her breathing hard. She was also holding her left arm against her body at an angle that wasn't right. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm fine," she said. The same words she'd said to Lucien that afternoon, and with the same quality. Not reassurance, but instruction. Don't make this about this. "Celine, annex," she said. "Now." He pushed the door open. The terminal was active, the screen casting pale blue light across the room, which meant the backup power was holding. She moved to it immediately, her right hand moving across the keyboard while her left arm stayed pressed against her side, and he stood behind her and watched the door and felt the particular texture of this moment, the absurdity of it and the gravity of it simultaneously. The fact that everything that happened next depended on a woman typing with one working arm in a darkened room, while the estate she'd grown up in was being systematically breached around her. "How long?" he said. 3 minutes, she said. "Maybe 4. "We don't have 4. "Then watch the door," she said, and her voice was so absolutely calm that it made the back of his neck tighten, because that kind of calm isn't the absence of fear. It's what's left when everything except the immediate task has been stripped away. He watched the door. He heard footsteps in the corridor, more than one set this time, coming toward them. He looked at Celine's back, at her hand moving across the keyboard, at the blue light on her face showing him an expression of absolute focused concentration, and he thought about standing on a courthouse step and laughing, and about all the versions of what a person is that you can miss when you decide, without evidence, that you already know. The footsteps stopped outside the door. The handle moved. Damien put his shoulder against the door and held it, and felt the pressure from the other side. Substantial, organized, the pressure of people who were going to come through this door and who were not going to be stopped by one man's body weight. And he looked back at Celine and said her name once, low and urgent, and she said without looking up, 10 more seconds. The door moved against him. He pushed back. 9 seconds? 8. The door burst inward and Damien went with it, off balance, and the corridor rushed into the room in the form of 2 men who were large and fast and had the specific efficiency of people for whom this was professional rather than personal, and the room became a place of violent motion and the sound of impact and the sound of Celine's voice saying one word, "Done." And then the lights came back on. All of them. The estate's full lighting flooding every corridor and room simultaneously, which meant someone, Lucien, had restored power and control of the house. The 2 men stopped moving. In the sudden comprehensive light, Damien could see their faces, and he could see the moment they recognized that the advantage they'd had in darkness was gone, and he could see the very brief, very specific recalculation happening in their eyes. From somewhere in the house, Lucien's voice carried down the corridor, not shouting, but pitched to travel. "Stand down!" Not to his own men, to them. The 2 men looked at each other. They looked at Celine standing at the terminal with her left arm held close and the transmission bar on the screen reading 100% complete. They looked at the doorway where 3 of Lucien's security team had appeared with the expression of people who had already decided the outcome of this situation and were simply waiting for the other party to reach the same conclusion. The 2 men lowered their hands. Damien stood in the middle of the room with his chest heaving and his hands bleeding from somewhere he hadn't noticed getting cut, and looked at Celine. She was looking at the screen. She turned to him. Her left arm was worse than she'd indicated. He could see it now in the full light, the way she was holding it, the color of her face. She needed medical attention. She was not going to ask for it. "It went out," he said. "Every family council, every federal financial liaison on Vittorio's contact list, and 3 international regulatory bodies," she said, simultaneously. "Time-stamped. Uneditable." She paused. "He can't put it back." Damien looked at her. This woman who had walked into his life and his operation and his marriage as a mechanism and had stayed as something more complicated, and who was standing in front of him now with a damaged arm and blue light on her face, looking at him with the particular expression of someone who has completed a very long and very costly piece of work and is finally, at enormous price, done. He opened his mouth. The window on the far wall shattered. Not gunfire this time, impact. Someone coming through it. And before anyone in the room could respond to the entry, the figure landed and straightened, and the room understood, in the collective way that rooms understand certain presences, who it was. Vittorio Sans was 64 years old and looked nothing like what Damien had expected, which was the point. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated, which was the sharpest possible weapon in the world he'd built himself. He looked at the screen, at the completed transmission bar, at Celine. And for the first time in what Damien suspected was a very long time, Vittorio Sans looked like a man who had run out of moves. His hand came up with a weapon in it, aimed at Celine, and his face had the expression of a man who has decided that if he cannot have the outcome he planned, he will settle for the damage he can still do. And Damien moved without thinking, without calculation, without any of the cost-benefit machinery that had governed every decision of his adult life, and stepped between them. The shot went wide. Not by much. Not by the comfortable margin that allows retrospective calm. It went wide by the distance of Damien's shoulder, intersecting with Vittorio's aim in the half-second between the decision and the discharge. And the round took a chunk of plaster from the wall behind where Celine had been standing, and the sound of it in the enclosed room was enormous and immediate and physical. A pressure that hit the chest before the ears processed it. Damien went down. Not from the shot had missed. He went down from the impact of Vittorio's follow-through, the weapon swinging as a club when the shot failed, catching him across the left temple with enough force to drop him to one knee on the tile floor. His vision whited out for 1 full second and came back fragmented, the room arriving in pieces. The terminal screen, the broken window, Celine moving to his left, Vittorio already repositioning. The 2 men who'd come through the door were dealing with Lucian's security team in the corridor, which meant the room contained 3 people and 1 weapon and a geometry that was shifting too fast for Damien's concussed processing to track cleanly. He heard Celine's voice, sharp, commanding, a tone he'd never heard from her in 3 years of marriage. "Vittorio, stop." Vittorio stopped, not because the word stopped him, because Lucien Moretti was in the doorway. Lucian moved into the room with the measured pace of a man who has already decided every variable and is simply executing the conclusion. He was not running. He was not shouting. He had 2 of his men behind him and a weapon at his side that he was not raising, which was its own kind of statement. The statement of a man who doesn't need to raise it to communicate what will happen if he does. He looked at Vittorio. Vittorio looked at him. 40 years of history occupied the space between them. Damien, on one knee on the tile floor, with his vision still returning and his left temple producing a pain that was sharp and rhythmic and very clarifying, could feel the specific weight of it, could feel that whatever was about to happen in this room had been building since before he was old enough to understand the world these men operated in. "Vittorio," Lucian said. Just the name. The same way he'd said princess on the courthouse steps. 1 word doing the work of a paragraph. Vittorio's weapon was still in his hand, not raised, not lowered, suspended in the specific limbo of a man deciding whether the version of himself that shoots his way out of a room is still viable. "It's done," Lucian said. "The transmission went out 20 minutes ago. 15 families, 4 federal liaisons. It's in too many hands to contain." He paused. "Put it down."
You're going to stand there, Vittorio said, and his voice had a quality Damien hadn't heard on the phone. A raw edge under the warmth, something that had been under pressure for a very long time and was now at the surface. And tell me it's done, after 40 years, after everything I built. You built a trap, Lucian said, and you built it inside my family. Your family. Vittorio's jaw moved. Your family that took everything the rest of us were owed. Your family that sat at the center of every negotiation for 4 decades and called it arbitration. You were never neutral, Lucian. You were just better at hiding what you wanted. Maybe, Lucian said. Put the weapon down. She was inside Ashcroft's operation for 3 years, Vittorio said, and now the weapon was moving, not toward Lucian, but toward Celine, who was standing at the terminal with her damaged arm and her face absolutely still. 3 years building a case. Against you. Against me. Against all of us. And you call her princess on the steps of a courthouse like she's something precious. His voice cracked once, just once, and then sealed itself back. She's a weapon, Lucian. You made her into one. Don't pretend you did it for her. The room was very quiet. Celine was looking at Vittorio with an expression Damien couldn't fully read. Not fear, not anger, something more complicated, something that had history in it. You knew my father, she said. Vittorio looked at her. Say it, she said. You knew him. A long pause. Yes, Vittorio said. And you had him removed, she said, 12 years ago, when he started asking the same questions I've been asking, when he started finding the same records I found. The room absorbed that sentence. Damien looked at Lucian's face and saw something there that wasn't surprise, which meant Lucian knew, had known, which meant this particular truth had been sitting in the architecture of everything for 12 years, and Celine had known it for some portion of that time and had still been precise enough, patient enough, controlled enough to... Your father made a choice, Vittorio said. Don't, Celine said. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped to a register that was quieter than anything she'd said in the room, and therefore more final. Don't explain it. Don't contextualize it. Just answer me, yes or no. Vittorio looked at her. Yes, he said. The words sat in the room like something that had been waiting to exist for 12 years and had finally been given permission. Celine nodded once, a small, precise movement, the movement of someone checking the last item on a list that has taken a very long time to complete. Then she looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at Vittorio. He raised his weapon. Whoa. What happened next happened in segments that Damien's memory would later be unable to assemble into clean sequence, because the brain under sufficient adrenaline does not record linearly. It records in flashes and sensory fragments, in the specific details that the survival instinct judges worth retaining. Vittorio moved first, not toward Lucien, but sideways, a trained lateral movement that cleared the door and put him in the corridor where his remaining men were. And the shooting that followed was loud and close, and the tile floor of the communications annex was very hard under Damien's hands as he got flat against it. Celine was already down, not hit, down by choice, below the line of the doorframe, her right hand pulling Damien lower by the collar of his jacket, with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a woman running one functional arm. The corridor outside was a contained catastrophe. The sounds of it, impact, voice, the specific percussion of a fight in an enclosed space, came through the door frame in a rush that lasted approximately 90 seconds and felt much longer. Then it stopped. Damien raised his head. Lucian was still standing. One of his men was down, breathing. Damien could see breathing. And Vittorio was gone from the immediate space. He's moving to the east exit, one of Lucian's men said from the corridor. Lucien was already moving. He said, without looking back, "Stay with her." Damien looked at Celine beside him on the floor. Her left arm was bad, worse than before, and the exertion had made it worse still, and her face had the color of someone operating on reserves they hadn't planned to need. She was looking at the doorway where Lucien had gone with an expression that combined what appeared to be several years' worth of unresolved feeling into something too complex to name. "Your father," Damien said. "Later," she said. "Celine, later," she said, and looked at him, and whatever was in her face in that moment, the rawness of it, The thing that the 12-year patience had been built on top of like a foundation under a structure too heavy to show the weight, was the most unguarded thing he'd seen from her. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she sealed it. "Can you move?" she said. "Yes," he said. Lucien can't face Vittorio's full contingent alone. The transmission is out, but if Vittorio gets off this estate before it's confirmed received, if he can reach even 2 of the families before the documentation circulates, he rebuilds, Damien said. He narrows the damage, she said, which is enough. For him, right now, enough is enough. Damien got to his feet. The room moved sideways for a moment and then steadied. His left temple was producing a pain that had settled from sharp into the deep structural ache of something that would require attention it wasn't going to receive tonight. "The east exit," he said. "Where does it go?" "Service road to the rear gate," she said. "From there, the dock road. 15 minutes to the waterfront." The waterfront. The warehouse Vittorio had specified on the phone. The pieces are exactly where they should be. He hadn't been setting a meeting for Damien. He'd been placing his own exit. "He has people waiting there," Damien said. "He planned to finish here and leave," she said. "The people at the waterfront are his extraction." Damien looked at her arm, at her face, at the terminal behind her showing the completed transmission. "Stay here," he said. She started to stand. "Celine." He said it with the specific weight of a man who has, in the past 4 minutes, revised his understanding of someone completely and is now making a request that comes from that revised understanding rather than the old arrogance. "You're hurt. The evidence is sent. Let me—" "You don't know this estate," she said. "You don't know the road. You don't know where his people are positioned. Then tell me." She looked at him for a long moment. "East corridor to the garden door," she said. 30 meters to the equipment shed. Past the shed, there's a break in the perimeter wall. Original construction, Lucien never sealed it because he thought no one knew it was there. Vittorio knows it's there. She paused. Through the break, the service road runs north, 50 meters to where it joins the dock road. Lucien's ahead of him? "Lucien knows this estate better than Vittorio does," she said, "but Vittorio has more men at the dock." Damien moved to the door. "Damien!" He stopped. She was on her feet. She'd gotten up while he was moving, and he shouldn't have been surprised, and wasn't. She crossed to him and stopped close, and looked at him with those eyes that had been unreadable for 3 years, and were now, in the blue light of a communications terminal in a room with a broken window, readable in a way that he suspected she hadn't intended. "Don't die," she said. It wasn't a sentiment. It was an instruction. Delivered with the same quality as everything else she said, precisely without decoration. "Working on it," he said. He went. The east corridor was dark again. The main power had fluctuated and the backup lighting was partial, giving the hallway a gray, half-illuminated quality that made distances unreliable. Damien moved through it with his hand on the wall and the pain in his temple marking time, counting his own pulse in the specific way that pain makes you aware of the body's machinery. The garden door was where she'd said. He went through it into the night air, cool, carrying the smell of cut grass and stone, and paused for 3 seconds to let his eyes adjust. The grounds were not empty. He could see movement, Lucien's people in organized patterns across the main grounds, but they were oriented toward the front, toward the primary incursion points, and the east side of the estate had the specific stillness of a sector that had been classified as secured too early. He moved to the equipment shed, past it. The break in the perimeter wall was not obvious from a distance. It looked like shadow, like the variation of old stone settling unevenly. But up close, it was a gap wide enough for a person to move through sideways, and on the other side, the service road ran pale and straight in the ambient light from the city on the horizon. He heard them before he saw them. Voices, low and directional, coming from the north end of the road where it bent toward the dock junction. He moved along the edge of the road in the grass, which was wet with night dew and soaked through his shoes immediately, and kept the tree line to his left. The dock road junction came into view. Lucien was there, and so was Vittorio. and between them, arranged in a rough semicircle at the entrance to the dock road, were 7 men who were not Lucien's. Lucien had 2 of his own. The geometry was not favorable, and every person present understood it. Damien stopped at the edge of the tree line and assessed the situation with the cold speed of a man who has run out of the luxury of extensive deliberation. Vittorio was on the far side of the junction, near a black vehicle with its engine running. Lucien was 20 feet from him, with his 2 men flanking him, and the 7 were between them and the vehicle like a wall. Whatever conversation Lucien and Vittorio had been having was done. He could see it in the posture of both men, the specific stillness that follows the end of words and precedes the beginning of something that doesn't use words. Vittorio said something Damien couldn't hear at this distance. Lucien responded, also inaudible. Then Vittorio made a small gesture with his right hand, a minimal gesture, the gesture of a man who is accustomed to consequences following his smallest signals. And the 7 men began to move. Damien stepped out of the tree line. He had no weapon. He had a bleeding temple, soaked shoes, and the specific recklessness of a man who has, in the past several hours, lost his operation, his certainty, his model of his own intelligence, and the last remnants of the arrogance that had stood in for courage for most of his adult life, and found that what remained when all of that was stripped away was something smaller and less impressive and considerably more functional. Vittorio, he said. His voice carried in the night air better than he'd expected. Everyone stopped. Vittorio turned, in the dim light from the vehicle's running lights. His face went through something. Surprise, recalculation, a quick assessment of what Damien's presence here meant about the status of the estate, and then settled into a stillness that was more frightening than any of the expressions preceding it. Mr. Ashcroft, he said, you're persistent. I have something you want, Damien said. He didn't. He was improvising with an audacity that would have embarrassed him 24 hours ago and now felt like the only available currency. Do you? Vittorio said. The photographs, Damien said. Vanessa's photographs. Of the routing schema. They weren't in the file Celine transmitted. They're separate. They don't show your involvement, but they show mine. But there are annotations. He paused. Annotations in a handwriting that isn't Celine's, isn't mine. Vittorio was very still. In the peripheral area of his vision, Damien was aware of Lucien watching him with an expression he couldn't interpret. You're lying, Vittorio said. Maybe, Damien said, but you have to decide that in the next 30 seconds, because after that, those photographs go to the same distribution list the main archive went to, and whatever I'm lying about stops mattering. The 7 men were stopped. Not because of Damien, because Vittorio's hand had come up, the same small gesture, and they'd read it as hold. Vittorio looked at Damien with eyes that had been calculating the angles of rooms for 40 years. What do you want? He said. Same thing you do, Damien said. Out of this. Alive. And in exchange. The photographs don't go anywhere, Damien said. You get in that vehicle. You leave the territory. You don't rebuild. You don't reconnect. You disappear. He let a pause develop. I know that's not what you planned, but your plan stopped existing about 20 minutes ago. Vittorio looked at him. He looked at Lucien. Lucien's face was unreadable in the way of a man who has decided to allow something to play out rather than intervening in it, and who has his reasons for that decision. The photographs don't exist, Vittorio said. No, Damien said. They don't. The admission sat in the night air between them. Vittorio looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had been, for years, a piece on his board, a positioned variable, a mechanism without agency. And something moved in his face that was not quite respect and not quite disgust, but contained elements of both. You're not what I thought you were, Vittorio said. I know, Damien said. Neither was she. The silence stretched. Then, from the direction of the estate, the sound of vehicles. Lucien's reinforcements, coming at speed, their headlights cutting across the darkness above the perimeter wall. Vittorio heard them. He made the calculation that he'd spent 40 years learning to make in the time most people take to breathe. He looked at Damien one more time, at Lucien, at the 7 men who were waiting for a signal that was not going to come. Stand down,
he said to his men. To no one in particular. To the night. He turned toward the vehicle, and that was when Damien saw what Lucian had seen 30 seconds earlier, and Damien had missed. The eighth man, not in the semicircle, but behind the vehicle, raised and positioned and already aiming at a target that was not Vittorio and not Lucien. The shot was intended for Damien. Lucien moved faster than a 61-year-old man should have been able to move. He was between Damien and the shot before Damien had processed the threat, and the impact took him in the upper left side, and he went down to one knee on the dock road with the specific controlled descent of a man who refuses to fall all the way. The eighth man didn't get a second shot. Lucian's two men had him before the sound of the first one had fully dissipated. Vittorio had stopped moving toward the vehicle. He was looking at Lucien on one knee in the road with an expression that had shed entirely the calculated warmth and the 40-year composure. He looked like a man seeing something he hadn't permitted himself to account for in all the architecture of his planning. Lucien looked up at him from the road. His hand was pressed to his side. His face was pale and very set and entirely present. Vittorio, he said. His voice was steady. It's over. The two men faced each other across the dock road junction in the night air, with 40 years between them and the sound of approaching vehicles growing louder and the specific weight of the moment pressing down on everything. On the road, on the trees, on the men standing and waiting, on Damien 2 steps to Lucian's right, with his heart hammering in his ears and his hands that he didn't know what to do with. Vittorio Sans looked at Lucien Moretti for a long time. Then he looked at the vehicle. Then he looked at his 7 men, who were looking at him with the expressions of people waiting to be told what version of this story they were living in. He reached into his jacket. Every person at that junction made some involuntary movement, some preparation, some tensing, and then Vittorio's hand came out holding nothing except a phone, which he set carefully on the roof of the vehicle. My lawyers, he said to Lucien, will contact yours. Lucien said nothing. Vittorio nodded once, the nod of a man making a concession he has decided to make as though it were a choice rather than the only remaining option, and got into the vehicle. The 7 men dispersed. Not running, walking, with the specific controlled pace of professionals who know that running implies guilt, and guilt implies consequence, and consequence is something you manage by not showing it. The vehicle pulled onto the dock road and moved away into the darkness. Damien crouched beside Lucien and put his hand under the older man's arm. Can you stand? He said. Yes, Lucien said, which was only partially true, but they got him up together and Lucien stood with his hand pressed to his side and his breathing controlled and his eyes following the retreating lights of Vittorio's vehicle until they disappeared around the bend in the dock road. The reinforcement vehicles came through the gate. Lucien's people moved efficiently. Toward him, toward the dispersal points, toward the perimeter. Someone was already on a phone. The machinery of management was engaging. Damien stood beside Lucien in the dock road and looked at the empty dark where Vittorio's vehicle had been. The 8th man, he said. You knew he was there. Yes, Lucien said. You moved anyway. Lucien looked at him sideways. His face had the color of someone who was going to need significant medical attention but was not going to discuss that for at least another 10 minutes. She would have come out here herself if you'd been shot, Lucien said. With one arm. He paused. She's stubborn. Damien looked at the road. I know, he said. From inside the estate, through the broken geometry of walls and gardens, and the night between them, he could see a light in the communications annex window. Pale blue, the terminal still active, a woman standing at it because she was never going to sit down until she was certain the work was done. He looked at her light in the window. He looked at Lucien beside him, bleeding slowly and steadily and refusing to hurry. He looked at the dock road stretching away into darkness, where a man who had spent 40 years arranging other people's lives had driven himself into an exile that would, Damien was already calculating, not hold, not completely, not forever, because men like Vittorio Sans don't disappear, they reposition, and understood that tonight was not the end of anything. It was the end of one particular shape of things. What came after was going to require a completely different kind of accounting, from all of them, for everything, in ways that couldn't be planned from a dining room table or mapped on paper.
One of Lucien's men reached them and said something low and urgent about medical and transport, and Lucien waved it off with his free hand and said, "The annex first. I want to see her." "You're bleeding," the man said. "I'm aware," Lucien said. "The annex." They moved toward the estate, the three of them. Lucien supported on one side, Damien on the other, the night air carrying the smell of cut grass and cooling stone, and the specific aftermath of a situation that is past its crisis point but not yet arrived at whatever comes next. Above them, in the communications annex window, the blue light stayed on. The hospital they brought Lucien to was not a public one. It occupied the upper 2 floors of a building in the financial district that presented itself, from the street, as a private medical consultancy. The kind of place that had no signage beyond a suite number and a buzzer that required a specific sequence to activate. Inside, it had everything a hospital needed and none of the things that made hospitals feel like hospitals. No fluorescent harshness, no institutional smell, no waiting room with plastic chairs and old magazines. It felt instead like a place that had been designed by someone who understood that the people who used it were accustomed to environments that didn't announce their own functionality. Celine sat in a chair outside the room they'd taken Lucien into and waited. Her left arm had been set and wrapped by one of the facility's physicians. A hairline fracture of the radius, the kind of injury that was painful in a steady, insistent way rather than an acute one, the kind that made itself known every time you forgot about it and then tried to use the arm normally. She had a sling she was not wearing because wearing it made her feel like she was performing an injury rather than simply having one, and she had never been comfortable performing anything. She sat with her right hand in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on the door across the corridor, and she breathed. The waiting room, it wasn't called that, but it functioned as one, had 2 other chairs and a low table with a carafe of water and a window that showed the city's nighttime skyline at a distance that made everything look arranged, purposeful, geometric, as if the city had been designed rather than accumulated, as if the lights meant something other than the random aggregate of people in buildings doing the things that people in buildings do at 2 a.m. Damien was in the other chair. He'd had his temple treated, 7 stitches, delivered with a precision that suggested the physician had done this specific thing many times, and he sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and his eyes on the floor. He hadn't spoken in 40 minutes. Neither had she. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have been through something together and are separately processing what that means. She was aware of him in the way you're aware of something that has shifted in your field of reference, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way that a room looks different after you've moved a single piece of furniture. Everything is the same, and nothing is quite where it was. The door across the corridor opened. The physician, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Vane, who had the quality of someone who had long ago stopped being rattled by the conditions under which her patients arrived, came out and looked at Celine. "He's stable," she said. "The round didn't penetrate deeply. We've addressed the immediate damage. He'll need rest and monitoring, but—" She paused. "He'll recover." Celine breathed out through her nose. "Can I see him?" she said. 10 minutes, Dr. Vane said. "He's awake, and he's already arguing about it, which is, in my experience with him, a reliable indicator of general well-being." Celine stood. She became aware as she did that Damien had looked up, not toward the physician or the door, but at her. She felt the look without meeting it. She went across the corridor and into the room. Lucien was propped against the elevated back of the bed, with the particular expression of a man who has been told to lie still and has decided to lie still in a way that makes clear he is doing so under protest. He was pale in a way that the room's careful lighting couldn't entirely conceal. He had an IV in his right arm and monitoring equipment that he had apparently already requested be moved to a less prominent position, and he was watching the door when she came through it with the eyes of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. She crossed to the chair beside the bed and sat. They looked at each other. "Dr. Vane says 10 minutes, Celine said. "Dr. Vane," Lucien said, "has been telling me what I have 10 minutes for since 2009. "She's usually right." "She's always right," he said. "I choose not to emphasize that. Celine looked at his hands on the blanket, his right hand with the IV, his left hand resting open, palm up, the way hands rest when the body is too tired to make a fist. She put her right hand over his left one. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "My father," she said. "Celine." "I know you knew," she said. Not accusatory, just exact. "I've known you knew for 4 years. I needed to hear Vittorio say it. I needed—" She stopped. Started again. "I needed it to be on record, to be a thing that existed in a room with witnesses, not something I'd pieced together from documents and inference." Lucien's hand turned under hers and held it, carefully, around the sling. "I couldn't prove it," he said. "When it happened, when I started to understand what had occurred, what Vittorio had done, I had fragments. Not enough. And you were 14 years old." He paused. "I made a decision about what you needed and when." "I know," she said. "You've been angry about that." "Yes," she said. "For a long time." "Are you still?" he said. She looked at his face, at the lines in it that had deepened in 3 years, at the eyes that were, even now, even pale and horizontal, in a hospital bed, the steadiest thing she knew. "Not the same way," she said. He breathed. The monitoring equipment marked the rhythm of it. "Your father," Lucien said, and his voice had the quality of something that had been held at a specific pressure for a long time and was now being carefully released, was the most careful man I ever knew. He saw things early, saw Vittorio early. He came to me with what he had, and I told him it wasn't enough. I told him to wait." He stopped. He didn't wait. He moved on his own timeline, and Vittorio, his jaw tightened. "I was 3 days late. 3 days." The room held that sentence. Celine had imagined this conversation many times over 12 years, had scripted versions of it in her head at different ages, with different proportions of grief and anger, had revised it as she'd gotten older and understood more about the way things moved in the world these men operated in. The way information was incomplete, and timing was imperfect, and decisions were made under conditions that couldn't always be reconstructed into clean narrative afterward. She had imagined saying things in this conversation that she was not going to say. "I know," she said instead. "I know you were." His hand tightened on hers, very slightly. "The transmission that went out tonight," he said. "Vittorio's records. Your father's name is in those records. What he found. What Vittorio did about it." He met her eyes. "It's going to be part of the official documentation." "I know," she said. "I put it there." He looked at her. "It was always going to be in there," she said. "From the beginning. Everything I went into that marriage to build, the complete picture had to include what started it, what Vittorio was willing to do to protect his architecture. My father's name is evidence. It's also—" She stopped. "It's also just true. And it deserved to be true somewhere other than only inside my head." Lucien looked at her for a long time. "He would have been very proud of you," he said. "He would also have been furious about the method." "He would have been right on both counts," she said. Something moved in Lucien's face, the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been, not relieved of it, but joined in carrying it, which is different, and in some ways more significant. Dr. Vane knocked once and opened the door. "Time," she said. Celine squeezed Lucien's hand once and stood. At the door she paused. "The Moretti restructuring," she said. "The new code you're implementing. I want to be part of drafting it." Lucien looked at her. "You're not an enforcer," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm the person who spent 3 years inside a criminal operation documenting how financial architecture enables institutional corruption. I think that's a relevant qualification." He held her gaze for a moment. Then something shifted in his face that was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him since the courthouse steps. Small, precise, private. "We'll discuss it," he said, "when I'm not horizontal." She went back into the corridor. Heck, Damien was standing at the window when she came out. He'd moved from the chair at some point in the 10 minutes she'd been inside, and he was standing with one hand in his pocket and one at his side, and his eyes on the city skyline with the expression of a man who is looking at something familiar and finding it difficult to recognize. She came to stand beside him. The city was doing what it always did. Present, indifferent, its lights the aggregate of 10,000 separate ordinary situations that had nothing to do with what had happened in the past 12 hours. "He's stable," she said. "Good," Damien said. They stood at the window. "The Marsh situation," Damien said after a moment. "My CFO, I'll need to address that formally. Turn over what I have to the appropriate—" He stopped, tried again. "There are channels for people who want to come forward with documentation about their own operations. My attorney knows how to—" "I know," she said. "The NDA you signed," he said. "I'm releasing you from it. I'll have my lawyers draft the documentation. Whatever you need to say, to whoever you need to say it to, as part of the official record, I'm not going to be the mechanism that prevents that." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the window. His profile in the window's ambient light showed the 7 stitches at his temple and the specific exhaustion of a man who has been running on adrenaline for hours and is now feeling the departure of it. "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It has significant legal exposure for you." "I know what it has," he said. She turned back to the window. "There was a period," he said, and his voice was lower than usual, stripped of the register he'd used in boardrooms and conference rooms and the kitchen that morning, a morning that felt from this distance like something that had happened in a different calendar. "Maybe the first 8 months, before I stopped paying attention, which I know is not inadequate." He stopped. "There was a period where I knew you were remarkable. I knew it, and I decided it was inconvenient, that you were inconvenient, and so I stopped looking." He paused. "I just stopped looking." Celine was quiet. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. This isn't a negotiation. I'm just saying it because it's true, and because you deserve to hear it stated plainly by the person who owes you that." She looked at the city. "We were both instruments," she said, "in different ways, at different levels of awareness about it. What you did with your awareness and what I did with mine, those are different stories." She paused. "I'm not interested in adding up the damage anymore. I did what I went there to do. You did what Vittorio designed you to do, and then, tonight, you did something he didn't design you to do." She looked at him. "That matters." He looked at her. In the window glass, their reflections were superimposed over the city. 2 people standing side by side in a facility that wasn't a hospital, in the middle of a night that was ending, with the specific quality of persons who have arrived at a place they didn't plan to be and are beginning, slowly, to take its measure. "What do you do now?" he said. "Work," she said. "There's a great deal of it. The documentation that went out tonight is the beginning, not the end. There are regulatory processes, legal procedures, testimony, the restructuring of what Vittorio's network controlled, which is extensive and is now essentially rudderless. That takes time." She paused. "And the Moretti organization has its own accounting to do, internally. That also takes time." "And you," he said, "not the work. You." She considered the question. It was a question she hadn't been asked in 3 years, possibly longer. What she wanted, independent of what needed doing, independent of the architecture of purpose she'd built herself inside. "I want to sleep," she said, "for a significant number of hours, in a room that doesn't smell like someone else's life." He made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it had the shape of one. Brief, tired, genuine. The kind of sound that arrives without permission. "That's reasonable," he said. "Yes," she said. The weeks that followed moved at a different pace than everything before them. Slower, more granular, with the specific texture of aftermath, which is less dramatic than crisis, but considerably more demanding because it requires the sustained attention that crisis suspends. Vittorio Sans did not disappear in the way the word is commonly used. He surfaced, through his attorneys, in a jurisdiction that had extradition complications, and the legal machinery that had been set in motion by the night's transmission began the slow, grinding process of reaching him. It would take time. It would be contested at every stage. The attorneys on both sides were expensive and thorough. And expensive, thorough attorneys extend timelines in ways that can feel, from the outside, like impunity. But the financial records were in too many hands now. The documentation was too complete, too distributed, too specifically constructed to dismantle. Vittorio could contest and delay and reposition, but he could not rebuild in the territory he'd occupied for 40 years, because every family, every regulatory body, every federal liaison who'd received the transmission now knew the precise shape of what he'd built, and exactly how much of their own money and loyalty had been threaded through it without their knowledge. 3 of the families severed ties publicly within a week. 2 more followed within the month. The financial intermediaries who had served as Vittorio's infrastructure began, one by one, the process of cooperating with regulators in exchange for terms, which was how most financial architectures ultimately dissolved, not in dramatic confrontation, but in the incremental defection of people deciding that loyalty to a structure that cannot protect them is not loyalty, but simply expensive stubbornness. Daniel Marsh, Damien's CFO, was arrested on a Tuesday morning. He did not contest the charges. He cooperated extensively, and the cooperation produced additional documentation that reinforced what Celine had already transmitted. His testimony occupied 43 pages of deposition. Damien turned over the Ashcroft Capital records in full. It was handled through a formal cooperation agreement that his attorney had spent 3 weeks negotiating and that Damien had signed on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room that was not dissimilar to the one where he'd signed the divorce papers. Fluorescent light, industrial carpet, a pitcher of water nobody touched. He signed without ceremony, without the performance of regret, which he didn't have the resources for, or of resentment, which he no longer felt the specific entitlement to. He walked out of that conference room lighter than he walked in, which was not the sensation he'd expected and which he didn't know what to do with yet. He filed it as a thing to understand later and went back to the process of dismantling what remained of his business interests in an orderly way that minimized additional harm to the people who had been employed by it without knowing what it was built on. He did not contact Celine during this period. She was aware of what he was doing through channels that were professional rather than personal, which was appropriate, and she tracked the progress of it with the same analytical attention she gave everything, which was considerable and which did not. She told herself on the mornings when she thought about it too directly, constitute a form of watching over someone. It was professional monitoring of a cooperating party. She said this to Lucien on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after the night at the estate. He was in his study, upright again, and increasingly impatient with the pace of his own recovery, which was going well by any objective measure and not well enough by his. She was across from him with a cup of coffee she'd made herself and a folder of restructuring documents that had become the primary occupation of her waking hours. He looked at her over the rim of his own cup. "Professional monitoring," he said. "Yes," she said. "Of course," he said. She looked at the folder. "He did what he said he would," she said, "in full. He didn't negotiate the scope or time the cooperation for strategic advantage. He just did it." She paused. "I didn't expect that." "No," Lucien said. "I had him categorized." "I know." "I was accurate about the category," she said. "And then he did something outside the category, and I don't—" She stopped. Lucien set his cup down. He looked at her with those eyes that had always been able to read the rooms she couldn't quite close. "You cataloged his flaws correctly," Lucien said. "That doesn't mean the catalog is complete." She looked at him. "He stepped in front of a weapon," Lucien said. "Not because it was strategic, not because it was calculated. He didn't have time to calculate." He picked his cup back up. "People show you what they are under conditions that don't allow for performance. You know this. You've built 3 years of work on knowing this." She looked at the folder in her lap. "He lost everything," she said. "Yes," Lucien said. "His company, his money, his reputation, his networks. All of it is gone or in the process of going." "Yes," Lucien said. "And he cooperated without leveraging any of it for a better outcome." "Yes," Lucien said. He waited. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," Lucien agreed. "It's not nothing." Out. She found him on a Saturday in the late afternoon, in a part of the city she hadn't expected. A neighborhood that was neither the downtown where he'd operated nor the upscale residential area where his apartment had been, but something in between, the kind of neighborhood that was in the process of becoming something else and hadn't finished yet. A bookshop with an uneven facade. A coffee place with mismatched furniture. The particular energy of a place that hadn't been curated, that had arrived at its own character without anyone designing it. He was outside a building with a door code, holding a coffee in a paper cup and looking at his phone with the expression of a man who has too much time and is not yet comfortable with what that feels like. He looked up when she stopped in front of him. He was thinner, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way that months of pressure and loss and the cessation of the kind of eating that happens around business dinners and power lunches will thin a person. He had the look of someone who had been stripped of the layer of performance that professional success creates, and who was, underneath it, more plainly himself than he'd been in the years she'd known him. His temple had healed. The scar was visible, small and clean, slightly silvered at the edges. He put his phone away. "Celine," he said. Not the way he'd said her name in 3 years of marriage. Not the way he'd said it on the morning of the divorce. A different register entirely. Simpler, more direct, carrying none of the weight of what he'd thought of her and all of the weight of what he'd come to understand since. "I'm not here to check on the cooperation," she said. He looked at her. "Okay," he said. "I'm here because—" She stopped. It occurred to her, standing on this sidewalk in the late afternoon light of a neighborhood that hadn't finished becoming itself, that she had not planned this conversation the way she planned everything, that she had not cataloged variables or assessed outcomes or constructed the architecture of how it would proceed, that she had gotten into a car and driven here with the specific recklessness, or possibly courage, she was still deciding which, of a woman who has spent 3 years being enormously patient and has decided that patience is not infinitely applicable. "I'm here," she said, "because you asked me what I wanted. In the hospital, not the work, me." He was very still. "And I said I wanted to sleep," she said. Which was true, but it wasn't the complete answer. The street moved around them. A cyclist, 2 people with a dog, the ordinary Saturday afternoon metabolism of a place that had no idea what it was adjacent to. The late light was low and amber, the kind that makes everything look briefly like it means more than it does, and she was aware of it and accounted for it and chose not to let it alter what she was here to say. "I spent 3 years in a situation I chose," she said, "and I did what I went there to do, and now it's done. And I am—" She searched for the word with the precision she applied to everything. "I am not accustomed to what comes after. The work gives structure. The objective gives direction. Without those—" She stopped. "I don't have a great deal of practice at what comes after." Damien was looking at her with an expression she was only beginning to have the vocabulary for, something that had been developing in his face over the past several weeks, that she'd tracked through professional channels in the same way she'd tracked his cooperation. That was less about what he'd lost and more about what the losing had made room for. "Neither do I," he said. "I know," she said. "So we're both inexperienced," she said, "at the specific thing." She paused, "but not at other things. And some of those other things might be—" She stopped again. She was not, she realized, as fluent in this particular register as she was in most. It was a gap in her architecture. "Applicable," she finished. He looked at her for a moment. Then he held out the paper coffee cup. "It's still hot," he said. "There's a place 2 doors down. They have a table in the back that's away from the window." She looked at the cup. She took it. They walked the 2 doors and went inside and found the table in the back, away from the window, and sat across from each other in the mismatched chairs of a coffee shop that hadn't been curated, in a neighborhood that was still becoming itself, in a city that had continued its ordinary business through everything, as cities do. He ordered coffee. She ordered tea she didn't particularly want. The person who brought it was young and distracted and entirely uninterested in the 2 people at the table in the back, which was the correct amount of interest. They talked. Not about the case, not about the transmission or the documentation or the legal proceedings or the restructuring. They talked about other things, smaller things, the kind of things that constitute actual acquaintance rather than professional proximity. He talked about a book he'd read during the weeks of the cooperation process, something he'd picked up without plan and found unexpectedly absorbing. And the way he described it, with the slightly self-conscious specificity of someone who is out of practice discussing things that don't have strategic value, told her something about him that 3 years of marriage hadn't. She talked about the estate, about growing up inside those walls, about the things she'd known and the things she hadn't, about her father's study where she'd sat as a child reading things she was probably too young to read and understanding them imperfectly and going back to understand them better, which was, she recognized now, the beginning of a methodology that had carried her through everything since. He listened. He listened with the specific quality of someone who has recently discovered that listening is not simply the waiting period between your own sentences, and who is trying to be different about it without making the effort conspicuous. It was not a romantic conversation. It was not a reconciliation. It was not the resolution of 3 years of damage and a marriage that had been designed rather than chosen. It was two people sitting at a table in a coffee shop in the late afternoon, finding out who the other person actually was, which was, she thought, the correct place to start something. If something was what this was, that determination could wait. 6 months after the night at the estate, the Moretti restructuring was complete. The new organizational code, drafted over 14 weeks in Lucien's study, across a table covered in documents, with 2 attorneys present and Celine at the center of it, established a set of operational principles that were not naive about the world they operated in, but were specific about what they would and would not do inside it. It did not transform the organization into something it wasn't. It did not pretend that the world it navigated had cleaner rules than it did, but it drew lines, clear, written, witnessed lines, and it established, for the first time in the organization's history, a formal accountability structure that operated independently of Lucien's individual authority, a structure that would continue to function regardless of who stood at the center. Lucien signed it on a Thursday morning. He signed it with the pen he used for everything important, which had belonged to his predecessor, and the weight of the pen in his hand on that morning was the weight of all the years and all the decisions and the specific knowledge that this document would outlast him in a way that everything else he'd built was not guaranteed to do. He set the pen down. He looked at Celine across the table. "Your father," he said, "would have said it needed 3 more revision cycles." "He would have been right," she said. "He usually was." He paused. "The version we have is good, Celine. It's not perfect. Nothing is." He looked at the document. "But it's honest about what it is. That's rarer than it should be." She looked at the document. She thought about a man she'd known only in the years before she was old enough to know him fully. A quiet man, careful in the way of people who have looked directly at certain things and understand what looking costs, and felt the particular weight of completing something on behalf of someone who couldn't complete it themselves. It was not the same as that person being present. It was not closure in the clean sense that the word implies. It was something older and less neat. The satisfaction of a debt paid in the only currency available to a creditor who couldn't collect. It was enough. It had to be enough. And it was. On the morning Damien left the city, he did not announce it. He had arranged, through the cooperation agreement and his attorneys, the full disposition of his remaining assets in ways that addressed the damage as directly as the legal framework allowed. He had given testimony that was more complete than his attorneys had advised him to give, and he had done it without leveraging it for favorable treatment beyond what the cooperation agreement specified, which had produced a legal outcome that was significantly less punishing than it might have been and significantly more substantial than he would have accepted 3 years ago. He had one conversation in the early morning before he drove to the airport. He called Vanessa. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd known or guessed. "You're going," she said. "Yes," he said. "Where?" "I haven't finalized that," he said, which was true. He had a direction and a ticket and no specific endpoint, which was a condition of existence he'd never previously tolerated, and which now felt, more than any of the conditions he'd previously engineered, like something real. "Are you going to be all right?" she said. He thought about that. He thought about what the phrase meant and what it required, and whether the honest answer was accessible to him yet. "I don't know," he said. I think so. Eventually. Good, she said. And then, with the directness that he had always, he realized now, undervalued. You did the right things. At the end, I know they cost you, but you did them. He was quiet for a moment. So did you, he said. The memory card. You could have used it differently. I know, she said. Why didn't you? A pause. Because, she said, and her voice had the quality of someone choosing exactness over ease, I didn't want to be the kind of person who did. He sat with that for a moment. Take care of yourself, Vanessa, he said. You too, she said. Damien. He ended the call. He drove to the airport in the gray early morning with the city moving past the window the way it always had. Present, indifferent, its ordinary business proceeding without reference to anything that had occurred inside it. He watched it go. He did not feel the specific satisfaction he'd expected to feel the last time he'd pictured leaving, years ago, under different circumstances he hadn't managed to create. He didn't feel relief, exactly, or grief, or the particular triumph that had always been his preferred emotional register. He felt mostly the weight of his own decisions, all of them, the long catalog of them, the ones that had brought him here, and the ones he'd made when here turned out to be different than he'd designed. The weight was not comfortable. He thought it probably shouldn't be. He thought, with a clarity that was arriving later than it should have, that the weight was the appropriate texture of accountability. Not punishment, which implies that suffering the cost is the point, but recognition, which is something different, something that requires you to carry it forward rather than putting it down. He carried it onto the plane. He carried it into whatever came next. On the morning of the 7-month anniversary of the night at the estate, not that she was marking it, she told herself, and she was telling herself this while standing on the balcony of the Moretti estate with a cup of coffee in her right hand and looking at the city on the horizon. Celine Voss stood in the cool early light and breathed. The estate was quiet at this hour. Lucien was an early riser, but not this early. Not since the injury, which had adjusted his rhythms in ways he was adapting to with the particular reluctant practicality of a man who respects evidence even when it applies to himself. The grounds were still. The cypress trees along the east wall moved slightly in a wind too light to feel. The city on the horizon was the city she'd grown up watching from this balcony, from this same position. She'd stood here the morning after her father died, had stood here at 14 years old with an understanding of what had happened that was partial and terrible and the beginning of everything that came after. She'd stood here the night she decided to go into Damien's orbit, which had been a decision made not with grief, but with something harder and colder than grief, something that required grief to have already burned through and left behind a residue of pure purpose. She stood here now with the purpose completed and the grief still present, not the acute grief of the early years, but the permanent quiet presence of loss that becomes part of you rather than something that happens to you, that you stop trying to set down because it is simply, permanently, part of the weight you carry and have learned to carry correctly. She thought about the restructuring document, about Lucien signing it with his pen. She thought about the transmission, the completed bar on the terminal screen, the final click of a mechanism she'd spent 3 years building. She thought about her father's name in a legal record now, documented, witnessed, part of an official accounting that could be found and read by anyone with access to the relevant files. A man who had looked at the right things and paid for it, and whose looking had been finally vindicated, not in the clean way of stories, not in a way that gave him back anything, but in the way of truth that exists even when no one benefits from it directly. The way of truth that exists because it is true. She drank her coffee. The city came into color as the sun came over the horizon behind her. Gray becoming blue, becoming the specific gold of early morning that lasts only a few minutes before becoming ordinary daylight. She thought about a table in the back of a coffee shop, about two people who were inexperienced at what comes after. She took out her phone. She looked at it for a moment, then she put it back in her pocket. There was work today. There was always work. The legal proceedings were in their 7th month and would be in their 8th and 9th. The restructuring was complete, but its implementation was ongoing. There were meetings and documentation and the long, careful process of building something that worked differently than what it replaced. There was work, and she was good at the work. and the work mattered. But it was not everything. That was the thing she was learning, the specific thing that 3 years of singular purpose had deferred, the thing that came after, the thing that didn't have an objective or a timeline or a measurable completion state. She was learning it slowly, which was appropriate. She had always learned the important things slowly and correctly, rather than fast and approximately, and she saw no reason to change that methodology now. The sun finished its arrival. The gold became ordinary daylight. The city settled into its daytime pace, purposeful, indifferent, enormous, and entirely ongoing. She finished her coffee. She went inside. She had work to do, and after the work she had the rest of it, the unscheduled, unmapped, unmeasured rest of it. And for the first time in a long time, both of those things felt, in equal measure, like hers. Osh. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, organizations, events, and locations are entirely fictional and created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes.